Welcome, Katharine Murphy. Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview with me, Matthew Ricketson, for the Contemporary History Research Group at Deakin University. It's about the new quarterly essay, The End of Certainty, Scott Morrison and Pandemic Politics, which has just been released earlier in September. And I would like to ask you a number of things about the essay, which has already been well received and is generating a lot of discussion and so on. I'd like to start by asking you how you approached writing or researching and writing this essay, and how you managed to, if you like, fit it into your daily schedule, because it would have required time, and yet you're a daily journalist on the daily treadmill.
Well, thank you for having me, Matthew, and I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. Look, it's an act of madness, really, trying to do a 35,000 word long form piece in the middle of daily reporting of the most significant sort of public health and economic crisis that we've seen probably since the Second World War. It was an act of madness, but I was determined to do it for a couple of reasons. The first was I thought that the history that I was witnessing in that very basic journalistic act of bearing witness was really important to try and capture, and preferably in real time as possible, if possible, because this pandemic is sort of playing with all of our sense of time. And I thought the further we got away from these events, we'd be inclined to view them through a different lens. So I wanted to try and capture them as they happened almost. And just to get to the substance of your question, which was how, well, I took...
just before you do that, just because I obviously want to come to that, but the way in which the quarterly essay works as a kind of publishing operation is that they commission things in advance,
yep.
Several months in advance. Did that happen in this case? Because you're talking about, in a sense, you're reporting, or is it one of their commissions where they took advantage of a particular moment and in a sense, commissioned it quicker than they might normally have?
The commission changed. I was commissioned to do initially a quarterly essay style profile of the Prime Minister. That was the first commission. I can't remember exactly when that happened, but it was quite early in the year. But then, of course, COVID happened, and so a discussion between myself and my editor ensued about whether or not we would continue along the original path, which was the profile, or whether we needed COVID as well. We needed both events. And it was my very strong view that we did need both events. And in fact, the events, as I said a moment ago, I think were really important to capture, and if possible, capture in real time. And because they're just intrinsically important. But also as a device for a profile writer, it was quite important to me because Scott Morrison is a very difficult subject. He's quite... I say in the essay, it's sort of, I borrow from Gertrude Stein, there's no there there. He is very difficult to pin down and to capture the sort of intrinsic being that is Scott Morrison. And I thought I would probably do a better job on a profile if I could, through the lens of these events, it's almost like a telecast. You press pause, then you can turn your subject around a few different ways and think about your subject through the lens of the crisis and how he was responding to it. And that might give me, some important structure in the piece that would help me with my conclusions, or perhaps more pertinently, questions about the Prime Minister.
So I think you've also described him elsewhere, perhaps in one of your columns, as like a stealth fighter, a jet fighter, which are those, if you haven't seen the film, invisible fighters that only become visible, I think, at the very moment they're about to strike, or something like that. I don't best to be expert on that, but that's another metaphor you've used. And one of the things about writing a profile, particularly of politicians, particularly in this day and age, is taking absolutely the point you're making about him as an individual, but as a group, politicians are very hard to profile because they are so well defended in a kind of public relations sense. They don't answer questions they don't want to answer, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But your kind of thought or strategy was to, by seeing how he was actually acting in not only in situ but in a really, really important situation, that might be more revealing.
Yes, I just thought that, well, both were worthy enterprises, the profile and the history, but the history may aid the profile, and obviously the profile is shaping the history. So it was sort of, they just felt inextricable to me. So I was very keen that was the way we approach it. And even though it meant the piece ran long, the piece was a bit longer than the contemporary quarterlies are, that we might get some insight by combining the two.
And so what sort of insight do you think you did get from that process?
Oh dear, I've been asked this, and I can't help but laugh because I am very conscious that the essay raises a lot of questions, and while various conclusions are formed in the essay, and I hope a fairly accessible character sketch is put before the reader, there are a lot of questions about both this amazing event, and this guy that the essay doesn't answer, because there aren't yet answers to those questions. And rather than righteously sort of pretending there were answers, it felt a more honest process for me to acknowledge that there weren't answers, that there were questions that time and events would help us answer. So,
well, you've called your essay "The End of Certainty," Scott Morrison and Pandemic Politics, and it brought to mind a book that Paul Kelly, the editor at large for The Australian, wrote, I think, close to 3 decades ago now, also called "The End of Certainty." Yes. But there's, I don't think I'd be the first person to point out that there's something of a disjunction between the way in which Paul Kelly writes about politics and the way in which you write about politics, and just not to be too cute about it, but he writes with a kind of, well, it's called the voice of God, or this sort of Olympian detachment about whatever he's writing about. And one reviewer at the time that book came out rewrote the title of the book as "The End of Uncertainty," as a kind of jibe at Paul Kelly's kind of mode and the way he presents himself. You temperamentally, intellectually, or whatever, don't approach the world in the same way, and in your coverage of politics. So there's that. In addition, is it also something to do just with the sheer difficulty of actually trying genuinely to write contemporary history of particularly difficult to understand events, and events that are still, of course, unfolding?
It is very, very difficult, I've discovered, having attempted to do it, to write long form in a universal tone, and by that I mean accessible, whether the reader is reading it now or whether the reader is reading it in 20 years from now. It is quite difficult to get to land the tone of something that is timeless, that is being written while contemporary events are still unfolding. And whether I succeeded in doing that is obviously a judgment for others, but I have discovered that is quite a difficult exercise. In terms of the certainty and the certainty-uncertainty conundrum and my journalistic method, you're right, Matthew. I don't write in the Kelly style, and the Kelly style, of course, is a style of journalism that was sort of developed during the golden age of the profession, an age I confessed I missed. So I turned up after the golden age, and I've always had some issues with that sort of omniscient narrator style of journalism.
As have I.
It's just, it was never a good fit for me. I could never quite get the affect right. And by this, I'm not being snide or critical of the methods of others. In fact, I admire somebody who can sort of reflect on events with such certainty. I did, like, you know, God, wouldn't you wish for that? But I sadly am temperamentally unsuited to that. And also, I just as a journalistic method, I have some issues with it. It just doesn't feel authentic to me. So I basically.
So what are those issues, though? What particularly are you thinking about there?
Well, it's like, if we could sort of stick or think about the project for the moment, the essay for the moment, right?
Yep.
It's titled "The End of Certainty." We have within the covers of this essay, we have an uncertain narrator, that's me, an uncertain historian stroke journalist. We have an uncertain Prime Minister, because he doesn't know whether his hardest decisions are ahead of him or behind him, which is how the piece opens.
Yeah.
We have the uncertainties attached to these events, which we still we know a lot more about COVID than we did in January, but we don't know, for example, whether this is a set of conditions we're going to be living with for a long time. We don't know if this vaccine's going to turn up and be effective. We still don't know everything there is to know about this illness and the long-term implications of this illness. We've got an economic shock, which is the largest economic shock on record. We don't know whether this will be a sort of medium run or a long run thing. There's just uncertainty everywhere. And the only honest way I could capture that was to tell that story and not massage that content into a set of firm conclusions that in my view don't exist. So it was again that very, very basic act of journalism, which is very important to me, of bearing witness. Right, I say this to my team in Canberra all the time. Write what you see. Don't try and sort of purloin it into something other than what you are actually bearing witness to. So I mean, it's just every day, in terms of distilling this down, right? What's my problem with Voice of God? Well, it doesn't feel true to me. And as a journalist, every time I walk into my office and I open up my laptop, I have a little incantation I say to myself every day when I open my laptop. And I just say, tell the truth. And that's the truth for me. For others, the truth is this kind of what did you say, Olympian detachment, sort of this kind of crafting of daily events into, you know, there's three significant things that happened and here they are. It's just, yeah, I can't do that. I greatly admire and respect Paul Kelly, who's a person I've worked with. And obviously he is, you know, a giant among the pantheon of Australian journalism, but that is not my method.
One of the things that struck me in reading the essay was the number of people who you interview, whether they're politicians or epidemiologists or whatever, but particularly the politicians, for the reasons that we were talking about earlier, who are very candid in their interviews with you. And what came across to me was that they were not being candid as in the I'm engaged in a tell-all moment here. You know, they were being candid because they were being candid. So now I don't know if that was your perception too when you were interviewing them, but I'm interested in, and this goes to the importance of the current historical record, because there are, without parsing them, it seems to me there's at least half a dozen kind of quotes and comments and things and from various people which have not been on the public record to this point, and are very candid and illuminating of the situation that we all find ourselves in. So was that one of the things you were consciously seeking, or was it just in a sense doing your job and they happened and that sort of material came out, or something else?
I tried to set up the conversations I had with people by reassuring them that, by being honest about what I was doing, what this project was, that it was half history and half profile of the Prime Minister. And
it wasn't for tomorrow's Guardian.
And it wasn't for tomorrow's Guardian. I genuinely, with everybody I spoke to for this piece, I said I want this to be at first draft of history standard. I don't want to get any facts wrong in this piece, and I want it to be indelible. I want it to be able to sit there on the record, so that when historians come to pull these events together, and I mean, God, how many PhDs will there be in this? How many books will be written about this? It's an incredible event. So I went in very humbly to these protagonists who I know very well and said, I have an aspiration of trying to write a history here. That's what I'm looking for. So if you can cooperate at that level, I would be really grateful. I want you to try and tell me the truth. How did this feel at the time? How were these decisions made? Because you don't have to worry about this being beaten up or take it out of context. This is a narrative. This will unspool over 35,000 words, but it needs to have I need human voices in this piece. It needs to be a documentary about humans making human decisions at an incredible time. So I think they all know me well enough to know that I was sincere in that. They would obviously have views about whether or not I lived up to my billing in terms of what I produced. Was I being fair or not? But I think they knew where I was coming from. And I think they themselves understand how important these times are for the history of the country, for their own legacies as political figures during this time. I think they really understood, and this was what was very obvious to me from my vantage point. They really understood the gravity of the times. Like you can criticize a bunch of things, bunch of decisions that were made during this period, whether it was right, wrong, indifferent, stupid, ideological, not ideological. We can have that seminar till the cows come home. But watching this group of people, I was very certain that they understood that the times were genuinely grave and these decisions were genuinely life or death. And so I think everybody was in the headspace to be able to want that recorded in a way that isn't, well, as you say, Matthew, it's kind of an interesting candor, because often with politicians sort of giving first-hand accounts of events, the ones that they're involved in, they're often self-serving, right? Because we are all humans and we all want to put our best face forward. And there was a bit of that in the interviews, but not a lot. And I think they were still processing themselves what the hell was happening, what happened to them, what they had to do next, and how these sort of decisions all fitted together. So I think that's why we landed where we landed, which I think was in a good and true place.
So let's give those who are listening to this or watching it or both some sense of a couple of the things that came out of those interviews. A couple that occur to me are the interview with Christian Porter, which is reported early on, this sort of family joke about him loving apocalyptic movies, but also Brendan Murphy being quite appearing to be very candid about the actual way in which the things were set up in National Cabinet and so on. And there's others as well. But I'm just wondering, because I have another question, but before that, if you could just give us a couple of examples of those moments of candor and what they revealed, or how they illuminate the contemporary history.
Yeah, I think Christian Porter's interview is they're all interesting, but I think he, in that spirit that we were just mentioning a minute ago, this is for history, can you be as honest as you possibly can? I think he was the 5-star interview of all of the protagonists, because he literally came to record exactly how he felt, including a couple of visceral moments. The day where Peter Dutton was diagnosed with COVID, and he was in his office in Perth, and he is separated. He has 2 young children, and his children were coming to him for the weekend, and he discovered on the Friday that Peter Dutton, who he'd sat next to at a cabinet meeting 2 days earlier for 4 hours, had been diagnosed with COVID, and how scared he felt at a few different levels, and frustrated because he thought, oh my God, I'm going to get sick, and I've been preparing my whole life to be a public figure at a time where my country needed me to make a contribution, and oh my God, maybe I'm going to be benched or something dreadful is going to happen. And also the emotion of his kids when he told them, no, you've got to go back to mum's, and he couldn't explain why, because they're little kids. And he narrates a scene of his children screaming outside his office door, which was quite true and powerful. So
it comes across like that. Yeah, it does come across very quite bracing.
Yeah, bracing, right? Like, this is the thing. I mean, it's and he also, I think, also reflected quite intelligently on, at various times in the piece, what they knew and didn't know, what they'd done before and what they hadn't done before. And he reflects at one point during the essay that normally in a time of crisis, one can look abroad to countries with whom Australia routinely compares itself with, and look for wisdom from elsewhere that we import into our own decision making. But when the Australian government looked elsewhere, looked to Britain and looked to the US, which are the 2 countries we routinely look at in order to compare our own democracies with them, that everyone had lost their minds. So it was sort of like, oh God, we are going to have to make our own decisions here. And that sort of realisation that happened in the cabinet. Also, he's very candid about how the bushfire experience made them hypervigilant for the second crisis, which was also quite an interesting reflection. As you say, Brendan Murphy was very candid. I interviewed him more than once because it's sort of the politicians I'm in sort of regular contact with. So updates are happening as you go, because you see various things happen or you cross-reference. But with Murphy, obviously, he was quite accessible and present during the crisis, but it's harder to get to officials. So I felt as though in order to do this justice, I needed 2 reasonably long interviews with him. So I did 2 interviews with him. And again, he was, I thought, very forthright about events around the creation of the National Cabinet. And also to give appropriate acknowledgement, Scott Morrison's interview was also extremely good. There were areas where I wished that we could have gone deeper in the conversation. There were areas that I wanted to get to in my conversation with the Prime Minister where I really wanted him to kick through the door and take me to a place where I hadn't been. But there were a couple of instances where he really didn't want to do that, and he shut down the conversation pretty quickly. But in terms of his general reflections on the crisis, on his own decision-making in the crisis, on his own political philosophy, on other areas like that, I thought came to the interview in a spirit of wanting to put that stuff on the record. Okay. And again, that was very helpful. So I'm really, if we've nailed the history, I'm really grateful to these protagonists for helping me do that.
Okay. So one of the elements there, which you mentioned at the beginning, and I'll kind of twin it with something about the way in which you've written about Scott Morrison, is that, I mean, you've been in the Canberra Press Gallery since, I think, 1996. And shortly before the end of the Paul Keating era.
Yes, I had 2 weeks of Paul Keating Prime Minister. Right. Yes.
So you've been there and covering politics for a long time. How important is it that do you think that the fact that you know most of the protagonists in this sense from both major parties and the minor parties, to build that relationship so that when you, like if I just rolled up and said to Christian Porter, this is what I'm doing a quarterly essay and I want you to reflect openly, I think it's extremely unlikely that he would have the kind of interview with me that he did with you.
It's an interesting question, Matthew. I don't know whether or not Well, I suppose different writers would get different interviews from subjects. You know, I guess that's true, and they all know me. So it's sort of so I guess there's a level not of comfort because they all know me, but no, it's not really comfort. It's more that I think they all took the decision that they may not like what came out of the end, but I would be fair. I think that was sort of the calculation that they all made in different ways. Not that they would love everything, but that I wouldn't misrepresent what they had said. So perhaps that gets you a better interview. Perhaps being a little bit of a known quantity in terms of a relationship also gets a better interview. And they know, I was talking a minute about revealing methods to readers. You know, they know about our methods because they view them at close range, right?
Yeah,
so
they're expert on that methods.
They know how we operate. So I guess there was a certain known quantity about it. The thing is that, though, of course, the debate, the professional debate about press gallery journalism is always that, you know, there's a bit of Stockholm syndrome, or that we get captured, or that we become amplifiers of the government of the day. I understand all of that debate, and that's all fair and reasonable, that debate be had. But I was very conscious, well, I'm very conscious in my journalism generally, but also in this project specifically. Like, again, one of my mantras, you know, I've done the tell the truth mantra again. It's very sincere. I know this sounds hokey, but these are methodologies I approach. So I need in order to do my job. So open the laptop, say, tell the truth. Running the mantra for the project in my head was close but not captured. That was what I said to myself throughout the project. You are close, but you are not captured, which sort of goes back to telling the truth. So you sort of got to...
There's a line early on, very early on, where you're talking about Scott Morrison agreeing to sit down and be interviewed by you. And there's a couple of sentences which I'll read, which are not the kind of sentences that a captured journalist writes, if I can put it that way. So he sits down and you say, I don't know the secret handshake of the yes mate club. Morrison and I bump along convivially enough, but periodically I irritate him, and we both know I'm not of much use to him. So don't expect much sharing. So I turn on the recorder and pick up my pen. Now, the thing that struck me about that is it's close because you're in the room with him, but you're not captured by him. There's a kind of gender element in the sense which you're kind of implying there. There's also a kind of professional honesty, as in revealing to the reader, either implicitly or otherwise, that politicians are very transactional, and if the outlet that you're writing for or broadcasting for or whatever is of use to them, they will talk to you and yes mate, no mate, whatever. If it's not, doesn't matter how much they like you, they won't. So that kind of insight into the kind of brute mechanics of the way in which the relationship between the media and a politician works is, you don't make a big deal out of it. I've made a bigger deal out of it now than you ever did, but it's there and it's explicit in the essay.
Well, it's sort of, again, it's important to sort of foreground those things with readers. And also it was just about putting the reader on the spot. I wanted to, because I was in a position to be able to do this, I wanted to be able to take the reader with me into the Prime Minister's office in order to open the piece. I thought it was very important that we opened there. And that I described that, and I described the conversation that is happening between the person trying to create the history and the protagonist and the person making the history. Because again, then everything's explicit in that relationship, and it also puts the reader on the spot and tells the reader something about our respective methods, the Prime Minister and mine. And it also, though, I think I hope it sort of transcends that anecdote or that description in a way, because the fact that I'm there and he is tolerating me being there means we've moved out of a transactional mode. we are in fact, or maybe we're doing a transaction for history. I don't know what we're doing really in that moment, but it's, but that he understands tacitly, and so do I, that it's pretty important conversation that we're going to have there. And it's outside the realm of the yes mate transactional stuff that this Prime Minister specialises in. And I'm well outside that club. I'm not a member of Yes Mate. I don't know where Yes Mate gathers. I don't know what the handshake is. I'm certainly not part of Yes Mate. And anyway, it was sort of a little bit of shorthand telling you again, I'm starting with a character study of this guy in the opening, and I'm telling you, the reader, about my method as journalist and historian, and situating you in a conversation that is going to, I hope, briefly levitate above the transaction and try and get to some sort of truth. And again, I wanted to respect that conversation sufficiently by posing questions that I am not yet able to answer. Whereas some people would feel a massive pressure to, having posed the questions, to provide complete answers. I felt it was more respectful to what we were doing there, to nail what we could know and ask questions about the future that the future will provide answers to.
Okay. Well, speaking of the future, I mean, at the very end of the essay, it says that the date is the 19th of August, 2020. And obviously that's about 6 weeks ago now. And the world being what it is at the moment, things have moved quite rapidly since then. And your questions that you're asking about the way in which the Prime Minister and the government are responding to the pandemic. If I just read your more recent columns in the Guardian Australia on the weekend and so on, you're in the essay, you're kind of relatively open and sort of, I'm not sure where this is going to go. He's not sure. But in recent columns reporting on recent events up until the end of this month, September, you seem to be more concerned and more worried about the direction in which things are going. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing, because this is the difficulty, as we referenced a minute ago, of writing history in real time, or writing a documentary, call it documentary, is that I basically had to submit this piece. I think there was about a 3-week publication time thereabouts, so I'm actually just working back on my own timeline. That's right, so that it appeared in, so anyway, yes, 19th of August. So you sort of, we're at that point. I can't know what's ahead, but there's a fair bit of signposting in the piece about what's ahead, and what's ahead may not be great. Because in the part of the reason for wanting to record this history is some quite remarkable things happened in the opening stage of this pandemic during the first wave. That there were a whole bunch of partisan operators who put down tribalism for 5 minutes in the service of solving a problem, and boy, that was refreshing. Boy, that was a thing to bear witness to and to watch. Again, which is why I was sort of obsessed with recording it, because the further we get away from it, the more we'll forget it even happened. But it absolutely did happen, and it was important. Where we're going now seems to be a bit more of a reversion to type. We're seeing a sort of return of politics as usual, which is not only Morrison's doing. There's a lot of pressures in the system which is sort of forcing the return of politics as usual, as depressing as that is. In terms of looking forward and building a legacy, because again, the sort of profile element of the essay is sort of saying here is Scott Morrison, a Prime Minister who is pragmatic, transactional, protean, built for flight, doesn't like constraints, doesn't like conventions, doesn't like typecasting, doesn't like philosophical discussion, just likes to crack heads and get stuff done, right? Like, this is the sort of impression I'm creating of this guy. But the thing is, Scott Morrison will not be able to outrun his own legacy in the Prime Ministership. We will basically see a legacy from this Prime Minister, even though he likes that, aerodynamics in stealth fighter mode, or ability to leave the scene quickly, right? He is built for that. He doesn't want to be weighted ever by anything much, convention, legacy, ideas. He doesn't like it, really chafes against it. But the prime ministership is the sum of a record. It's the sum of decisions. It's the legacy that you will leave through thousands of accumulated decisions. They will kind of give us a picture of this man that is his own history. And we look at the moment, we seem to be going in a more predictable direction in that vein. It's not only the return of partisanship, but also one of the elements in the essay is that Morrison is in dialogue with his own political movement throughout about what he can get away with in terms of pragmatism, right? Like when does the ideology chokehold arrive for this prime minister is one of the sort of subplots in the essay. And we can see the requirements of the firm starting to assert themselves in the way that the prime minister's now acting. Like the parliamentary colleagues do not want him to be prime minister of the premiers, which is a job he quite enjoyed. But I think that's basically, they've brought the hammer down on that. No, you are the prime minister of the Liberal and National parties. And this prime minister will define not only himself and his own prime ministership, but the location of the centre right, where it sits along the ideological spectrum through the decisions that he'll take over the next 6 months. That's the budget and the aftermath and plotting the path to COVID recovery. And look, all the signs at the moment is that we're sort of startlingly retro. We're sort of we're kind of heading back to the 80s with a bullet in terms of some of the economic thinking that is being telegraphed in the lead up to the budget. It's sort of, lower taxation, get rid of any unnecessary regulations that they would see on the economy. Build in fossil fuels for another 40 years. It's like we've woken up in 1985 and the GFC never happened, and climate change, it sort of isn't lapping at our doors. So look, maybe it'll be better than this. I really genuinely hope it will be better than this, but at the moment the signs aren't tremendous.
Okay, I think we will finish there on that
depressing
suitably
note.
Kind of I don't quite know where things are going moment, because that's in a sense what it is, but it's in the meantime we have a solid object in the form of a quarterly essay, which obviously required a lot of work and thought to put together, which can stand as a piece of contemporary history or long form journalism or whatever we want to call it for this moment, for the first kind of half to 2/3 of the year. Mm-hmm. and then we all go on into the next
well, then, if I did this piece now, if I was doing the next chapter, if I was going to do another quarterly for the next 6 months, what happens in the next 6 months? I may well ask different questions. There may be different framing questions that basically kind of are required for framing of the next 6 months. So it's not static. You've got to change your vantage point and look at what's going on in order to record it as accurately as you can.
Thank you very much, Katharine, for your time today to talk to us about your quarterly essay, The End of Certainty. Very much appreciated your time and your insights today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I love the conversation.